Have you ever wondered what makes creative people tick? Where do their ideas come from? What keeps them energized? What kinds of things get in their way? Is their life really as much fun as it looks from the outside? Hello, I'm your host, Lily Pierpont, and this is ArtStorming, a podcast about how ideas become paintings or poems, performances, or collections. Each episode, I'll chat with a guest from the arts community, and we'll explore how the most creative among us stare down a blank canvas or reach into the void and create something new. In our inaugural season, ArtStorming the City Different, we dipped our toes into the vast ocean of creativity with a focus on some of our favorite creators of Santa Fe, New Mexico. That conversation was enjoyed by artists and non-artists alike because it showed us how we can all benefit from learning how to generate something from nothing, dream bigger, charter new territories, and solve problems in new ways. In Season 2, we're going to take that concept of generating our lives with intention to the next level. This season, we're talking about legacy, art as legacy, and how the most creative among us tackle this rich and deeply personal subject. Welcome to ArtStorming, the Art of Remembrance. When we hear the word legacy, we usually think of something a person leaves behind, a name on a building, a statue, or a family inheritance. But what if the legacy which lives beyond us is the community itself? Today we're shifting our lens away from individual achievement and toward the collective soul of a city. Joining us is writer and historian Pen La Farge, a man who serves as a living bridge to the deep, complex memory of New Mexico. Through Pen's story, we see a legacy of a place that spans centuries, from his mother's Baca family roots dating back to 1600, to his father's transformative work documenting the Navajo and Hopi languages. But more importantly, we're exploring the golden age of Santa Fe, a time when three distinct cultures didn't just coexist, they integrated. It's a conversation about memory, change, and how we honor the places we love. Let's explore the city different with Pen La Farge. All right, so I am ArtStorming today with Pen La Farge, and I really wanted to talk to you because this particular season is about legacy, and I thought it would be really interesting since you're a writer and you've written a book about remembrances of Santa Fe. You come from a legacy family. There are so many layers to legacy about what you do as a historian, as a writer, and so I thought it would be really interesting to catalog the legacy of community, the legacy of a community like Santa Fe. And so that's where we're going to start. So tell me a little bit about your family, how long you've been in Santa Fe, and what you understand about the legacy of Santa Fe. That's a big topic.
Yes, I would say that's huge. My family, my mother's family is Spanish, Baca. And the Bacas came in 1600, so we've been here for 400 years. My father, the La Farge family, my father first came here as an anthropology student at Harvard to study the Indians in the summers of 1923 and 1924, and then returned regularly throughout the 20s and 30s, occasionally to live with his first wife for a while, 1929, 1930, but returned to go on anthropological expeditions through the Navajo country, through Hopi country, back when there weren't any roads, one had to pack in, otherwise one didn't get
Was
there.
he a contemporary of Natalie Curtis?
Yes, a little bit
later.
Yes, but yes.
Wow, because I've read the book Ladies of the Canyons that talks all about this incredible group of women that came through Santa Fe, and she happened to be very interested in cataloging the dance and song of the Native Americans. So your father was right in that camp.
Well, my father was arguably the premier student of an expert on the Indians in North America, and to a large extent Central America, because that's actually where his anthropological work took him in the 20s, and to a lesser degree in the 30s, was to Mexico and Guatemala to study the Maya. He was an ethnologist, so he studied their languages, the Mayan language, trying to determine how they were related and how they went back, or if they went back, and how they went back to the ancient Mayan. So that was his work in the 20s and 30s, but he also worked with the Navajos and the Hopis, and his work with the Navajos resulted in his creating the first Navajo dictionary, the first Navajo alphabet, and that is how he came to know the Navajos so well as to be able to write Laughing Boy, which novel shows a deep knowledge of them as people, of their culture, of their thoughts, of their folkways, and he was able to do that because he knew them so thoroughly. And so he came here to Santa Fe to start off on his expeditions to Navajo country. And then he also worked with John Collier, who later was the superintendent of Indian affairs, on creating a constitution for the Hopis, which, because they're so quarrelsome, they've never passed. So, yes, that's my father's connection. Then he did live here briefly, 1 year maybe, with his first wife. Then he returned after he had divorced his first wife and married my mother, who was from New Mexico. They returned here before the war, and then again after the war permanently.
Do you have siblings, other than a half-sibling that you mentioned earlier?
My father had 2 children by his first wife. The daughter, my half-sister, lives in La Mesa, which is south of Las Cruces, which until she moved there, I didn't know there was anything south of Las Cruces.
Wow. And so your mother was a Baca, you said, and that's
Yes.
obviously a very well-known name here in Santa Fe. But for the people who don't live here in Santa Fe, say a little bit more about your mother's heritage, and then we'll get more into you.
My mother's, well, how far do you want me to go back?
Well, 400 years is a lot of history.
Well, even before that, my ever so great, as Rudyard Kipling would have said, my great, ever so great grandfather was Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who was part of a major and very large expedition, the Narvaez expedition, that was shipwrecked on the Gulf Coast in, I think, 1530. And 4 men survived, one of whom was my great-grandfather, and another one famously was a blackamoor named Esteban. And they spent 7 years walking from the Florida Gulf Coast all the way across America to back into Mexico. It took them 7 years, often naked. There were times when they were made into gods and times that they were made into slaves. His account of this adventure is absolutely fascinating. It's a real-life adventure in which men who had no idea where they were going, or how to get there, spent 7 years, the first white men through this area, through southern part of what is today the United States, New Mexico, and back down into Mexico where they found the Spanish again. And then his grandson was part of the expeditions who came to New Mexico in 1600, the first settlers having arrived in 1598. And we've been here ever since.
Wow, that is quite a legacy. Your dad meets your mom, and he's obviously got this prolific career. Tell me your story. You were born here?
I was.
Okay. And were you raised here?
Yes. I was one of the first children born in what was then the new wing of the St. Vincent Hospital, which was downtown. The new wing in all of St. Vincent Hospital is no longer a hospital. It's moved and is now the Drury Hotel. So I was born there, one of the first children born there. And yes, I was raised here, went to Acequia Madre grade school, and then was a founding student at the Santa Fe Preparatory School.
And you went off to college, I presume.
I went off to boarding school and then to college, Boston University.
Oh, you went to BU?
I did.
I was there briefly.
Were you?
Yes, in 1979, for one semester. I didn't last long. It was too big for me.
I didn't go there necessarily because I did not go there because of its size. I went there because it had one of the best history departments in the nation. And the size of it and the amorphousness of it and the fact that its campus really is Commonwealth Avenue, not much of a campus, keeps me from having any particular sentiment about it. It's a large, amorphous university in which everyone is just a number. But my history department, the departments and the professors were really good, and I wanted to get a feel for them.
And so you majored in history.
I did.
What was your focus?
European history. More focused than that, I was a major in early modern intellectual European history.
I want to take another minute to remind you listeners that ArtStorming is a listener-supported nonprofit, and we need your help to keep the conversation going. Every dollar goes directly into programs that support our mission. That means more compelling stories, more in-depth articles, and a greater impact on our community. If you love what you hear, please consider making a contribution. Visit our website for more ways to engage, and thank you for being an essential part of our work.
So where did the book that you wrote come from in terms of that? Or was that more of a side gig?
It's really completely different. I had been raised with the idea that Santa Fe's golden age, as it were, was roughly the 1930s. As people said, everywhere else was the roaring 20s, here it was the roaring 30s. Not because there was a lot of wealth, there wasn't. The Depression hit everybody, but that was the period in which a lot of the artists came here. Few artists before and during the war, First World War. Most of the artists came afterward. Artists, writers, poets, photographers of all kinds came here in the 30s or the 20s, and then in the 30s, everything seemed to just coalesce and come alive, and it was a great time until the war. And it was a great time not in terms of wealth, but in terms of unity and culture and everybody enjoying themselves and each other. And it was a really lively, interesting place with a lot going on. So having heard all this about the time before I was born, or the very early part of my life, I wanted to record it so that people would know why it was that they either moved to Santa Fe or, having been born here, stayed in Santa Fe, what made it unique, what made it special, what makes it stand out, so that people who come here from thousands of miles, we come here from Japan, which is extraordinary because we really are in the middle of nowhere. And until the highway system went through, particularly the interstate highway system in the 50s, it was really difficult to get here. So people who came here really had to want to come here. And so why did people come here? What made this such a special place? What made it the city different? So I wanted to create a record of what it was like here in that period, roughly 1920 to 1955. So I thought about taking my historical training as a way of getting into it, but I couldn't think of any way to really capture the flavor of the place as distinguished from merely the events. That was more difficult. So it was about that time when I was in college and then graduate school that Studs Terkel's oral histories came out. And his book about the Second World War, the name of which escapes me. So I took that as a template. I thought, that's not a bad idea for capturing people's feelings and culture and thoughts and experiences as distinguished from just events, what happened. And I called him up out of the middle of nowhere. He didn't know who I was. But he lived around the corner from me in Chicago. in Chicago, where we lived around the corner from a friend of mine whom I'd gone to Boston University with. We were roommates. And so I called him up, and he was nice enough to talk to me about oral history. And so I came. I was really a hit and miss experiment, but it was an experiment, and it took a long time to do it. It took a long time for me to figure out how to do what I was doing, how to interview people. Interviewing is not a science, it's an art. And it's a difficult art to learn cold. And so I had to learn how to interview people and where to interview people and what questions to ask. So it was a long process, but out of that process came Turn Left at the Sleeping Dog.
And I just love the title. So when you grew up here, did you know you were living in a very special place? And so when you went east, you had that in mind. Was in the back of your mind that somehow you were going to come back to Santa Fe and explore its history further?
Yes and no. I didn't come back here with the intention after graduate school of creating a history or an oral history. I came back to be a writer, but the idea that the period that Santa Fe became the city different and became as well known as it is back then among a certain group of people, later on among greater group of people, that then it just sort of haunted me until I decided I had to do something about it. My training in history really wasn't terribly much geared toward this, but it was geared toward an interest in history and a love of history, but not how to do this particular thing. Not until I went away, really did it. I knew it was special. I knew it was unusual, if not unique. But I couldn't appreciate quite how until I went away, first to boarding school, then to college. Then it really bore in on me how different it was. And back then, it is different today, but back then it was a completely different world. I remember as a child hearing about or reading about places back east or in the rest of the world, and they always seemed a tremendous distance away from New Mexico. And in some cases they really were, but New Mexico was quite separated from the rest of the nation. Santa Fe was separated even further because we're in the middle of New Mexico. We really were far away, and many people didn't even know that New Mexico was a state in the Union, which is why our license plate says New Mexico, USA. No other license plate says that.
Is that true?
That's
I've
true.
never even noticed that, having lived here for 10 years.
It says New Mexico, USA, so we can prove to people who stop. I had a friend who was stopped on by a highway patrolman in Massachusetts when he was going to college there also. Worcester Art College. The highway patrolman wanted to see his international driver's license. And my friend said, I don't have one. I have a New Mexico driver's license. He says, well, that's no good here. You have to have an international driver's license. And my friend said, well, New Mexico's a state in the Union. The highway patrolman said, no, it's not. There's no such place as New Mexico. My friend said, yes, there is. And he said, no, this is old Mexico. You need to give me your driver's license. So my friend tried to convince him, and the patrolman said, where is New Mexico? And my friend said, it's between Arizona and Texas. And the patrolman said, there's nothing between Arizona and Texas. So my friend got out of his car and took him around to the license plate and said, see, it says New Mexico, USA, and that's why it's there. So that was the state of things when I went away back east to school. Some people knew New Mexico was part of the Union, but they didn't know really where it was or what it was like. They thought it was all desert and very hot. They viewed us as being like southern Arizona, which we're not. And yes, it was, we having Spanish culture here meant very little to anybody. Having Indian culture here, again, there are Indians elsewhere, but they tend to be almost invisible, and they've been deracinated. They don't live on their tribal lands necessarily, and they don't necessarily speak their language, and they don't necessarily practice their ancient religion. Here, all those things are true. So that, the Spanish heritage, my Spanish heritage, the fact that the culture here is largely formed, not entirely, but largely the Anglo culture here is formed by artists of all sorts, is completely different from the rest of the United States, where artists are those people over there. And we have anthropologists and archaeologists by the score. Many places in the United States you could never find either one. So this was a most unusual agglomeration of people and cultures, and it was very far away from the rest of the nation. So
It must have been so crazy for you as a kid from here with all that sophistication, which probably wasn't understood as sophistication on the East Coast, but with that very broad and deep. Even going from New York to Philadelphia, I was considered a complete anomaly when I was boarding school age. What was it like for you to try to fit into an East Coast boarding school?
Oh, I was a complete fish out of water.
I bet.
It was my father's culture, and I had visited and stayed with cousins on the East Coast, but it was still a very distant culture to me. I was very much a Westerner, very much a New Mexican. So when I got there, I was the only boy there that wore silver and turquoise. I think very well I may have been the only boy at my school who came from west of the Mississippi. And many of the kids didn't, if they knew where New Mexico was, it was vague. And I was a complete fish out of water to the point that one day I was walking down the main street of campus at Brooks School, and I came across one of the master's wives. This was early on. It may have been October or so of my first year there. I came across one of the master's wives, and I really liked the way she was dressed, which was completely different from anything in Santa Fe. It was very Eastern, but I liked it. Probably the first and only time this ever happened to her, I stopped her and I said, "I like the way you're dressed." And I think she must have been somewhat stupefied that a boy would stop her and say this. And she said, "Thank you." And I said, "Where'd you get your clothes from?" And she looked at me and she said, "L.L. Bean." And I said, "What's L.L. Bean?" And she looked at me as though I'd fallen out of a tree.
I can imagine. Well, it's of course the uniform of the East Coast of certain parts, but so did you find yourself wanting to shop at LL Bean? I can't imagine you in LL Bean.
Not necessarily, but I wanted to know where this look came from. So eventually I did become used to it, and then I fell in love with my school. My last year there, my senior year my sixth form year was wonderful. I really loved it, especially the spring. I didn't want to graduate. I may have been the only high schooler ever who didn't want to graduate, but I didn't want to graduate. I wanted it to continue. I had such a good time by the time I left.
Well, you must have made an impression on the other students there for you to go from feeling fish out of water to feeling like you didn't want to leave. So
I don't know.
You must have been quite the ambassador for New Mexico.
I don't know. I think
you're too modest to admit it.
I think they made more of an impression on me than I made on them.
Did you gravitate towards the art students or other history students?
Well, at a boarding school, one takes all sorts of different courses. It's not focused on anything as it might be in college. So there weren't art students per se. There were students who were more inclined toward the arts, and we had a mutual interest, but I can't say we formed any sort of interest group. And history was a love, but again, it was just a course among many. And I had an affiliation for the history professors, history masters, and the other students, but I wouldn't say they formed any.
Yeah, because at my boarding school we had clubs, and so we had arts clubs and history clubs and things of that nature.
We didn't have that.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So you just sort of kind of assimilated, and then you stayed on the East Coast for college, obviously.
Yes.
And then it sounds like you migrated towards Chicago on your way back west.
Well, I wanted to go to, I got my master's at Boston University also. I wanted to try something new, and I wasn't all that attached, as I said, to Boston University as a place, because there really is no place. It's a series of departments that are scattered along streets. So I had no particular fondness, and I still don't, for Boston University. I was fond of my friends. I experienced all sorts of new things and new people and new cultures when I went back east to college as well. I met my first people who were really from suburbia, because we didn't have suburbia here. They were from suburbia in New Jersey, in Connecticut, in Philadelphia, people who came out of a background that were essentially sort of like Leave It to Beaver, which I'd never encountered before. So I learned a lot from that. And I was fascinated about it. I wanted to try something new and different. So I went to Northwestern to work on a doctorate. And that's how I wound up in Chicago. And it also attracted me because my roommate from Boston University had moved there. And we had remained close friends. So he was my one friend in Chicago.
Yeah. Well, it's often said that, you learn more about your own culture when you go into a kind of more distant culture. It puts it into stark relief. And so
Yes.
it makes sense to me that by going to the East Coast, it would sort of bring you back and give you fresh eyes to look at Santa Fe.
And that was what emphasized in my mind how different Santa Fe was from everywhere else. It's different today, but back then, the differences were much more stark than they are today, because Santa Fe had not changed so much to become part of the national culture. We were still very much New Mexico, very much ourselves, and the national culture had not inundated us as the way it has now.
Yes. How soon after you got back did you start on the book? You said it took a long time for you to complete it, but you started your explorations into the art of interview and then compiling the stories.
Well, it wasn't quite as clear-cut as that, but yes. I started I'm not sure, I would say the early, middle 80s, 84, maybe 85, and started off interviewing, then realized I didn't know what I was doing, and sort of went back and picked up that stitch by trying to learn how to interview, which is difficult, I must say, and then continued learning and interviewing from there.
And how did you decide who you were going to include in the book?
People that most of them are people I knew, people I thought would be interesting and from diverse areas of our culture, people of Spanish American heritage, people, Indians, Anglos, of especially artistic Anglos or connected to artistic endeavors. Some of them I didn't know, or I knew distantly or through relatives. Most of them I knew, not all, but I wanted an interesting and varied agglomeration. And so I did my best to put that together. And since many of them are friends of mine, not all, many of them are friends of mine, that was fairly easy. On the other hand, some of them I didn't know, but we became good friends in the process. So that was somewhat hit and miss, but there was an underlying plan to it.
So it's interesting. I didn't realize that we had that in common until you just said that. But when I decided to do my first season, I interviewed mostly New Mexican artists. So the first season was called City Different. And I talked to mostly people that I had met in the first 9 years that I'd been here in New Mexico. And then as I didn't exhaust that pool by any chance, but I wanted to make sure that I was well-rounded in the same way that you did. So I started reaching out beyond my immediate circle of friends. And I found that those are now friends. I mean, these conversations just sort of created that scene. So did you find it more difficult to interview the people that you knew well or the people that you knew less well?
I don't think that made much difference. One of the first interviews in my book is Amalia Sena Sanchez, who was the first Fiesta Queen. She was 95 when I interviewed her. She lived to be 105. She was as sharp as a tack. I knew her and I knew of her through my grandmother, and to a lesser extent through my Aunt Josephine, my mother having died when I was 20. But she knew my mother. She knew my family well enough that she told me that she and her daughter had a running argument as to whether I looked more like my father or my mother. And so, although I had, met her in passing, I didn't really meet her until I sat down to interview her. And that was one of the easiest interviews I've ever had. I asked her one question. She talked for 45 minutes. So that's an interview. On the other hand, a woman I'd known all my life who had a fascinating life and a fascinating background, I interviewed her when I went back and listened to the tape at the end of it, cooking the interviews down into a book. I found that the interview I had with her was virtually useless. There was nothing there. It was just a lot of platitudes and empty phrases and a little bit of usable material. And so I went back and I interviewed her she was my first interview, and I went back and she was my last interview. And again, despite the fact at this point I had experience and knew more what I was doing than I had before, still it came out badly. Just, again, platitudes and empty phrases. A perfectly nice woman, a lovely woman with whom I enjoyed the interview, but there just was no meat there. So whether I knew the person or not was, I would say, irrelevant.
Well, I guess, your situation is different because you're trying to put together a sort of a comprehensive body of work, whereas my interviews are each one is a standalone. But do you feel that you got to know your city better having completed that project, or did it leave you with more questions?
Oh, both. I knew my city better. I knew its history better. I knew what it was like before I was born in my early childhood better. I learned all that. But yes, it left me with all sorts of questions, of course, yeah.
And have you considered a second book, or how has your work progressed from that point?
Well, the second book, the time for that has passed. All the people I would interview on a continuation of the book into a later period are either dead or dying. So that it would be nice, but it never happened.
And you don't find that there's like another sort of generation of people, maybe your contemporaries, that would have made an interesting follow-up to the book, or did you feel that it was complete?
Well, I don't know that it's complete, but no, I was always thinking about the time when Santa Fe wasn't as well recorded as it is today. Now everything is in the papers and everything is recorded and everything's on TV and everything today is known. Well known. All you have to do is find it. Back then, our history, our life, our culture was not as completely recorded as it is today. And I hadn't really thought until you brought it up of recording my own generation, but frankly, I was more interested in what made our generation, what made the culture and the place we were born into.
Yeah, I get that. And at the same time, it sort of makes me curious. I mean, one of the things that is very interesting about this project that I've been doing is that I get to have conversations that are beyond what you can know about somebody on their internet page, on their website page, or what you would read about them in the story. You get to the essence and the sense of a person. And of course, you've seen Santa Fe morph and change into the city that it is now. How would you say it's different now? I mean, I know that's a huge question, but what do you see as the biggest difference between then and now? And when I say then, I mean when your experience of it and not the people that you interviewed.
We're going to pause here for a moment to speak to our listeners. If you like this content and want more information on our guests, their projects, and more in-depth ways to engage with us, you can find us on artbridgenm.org or our ArtBridge Substack. Please read, follow, and share our content. Your subscriptions, shares, and contributions help us grow our artistic community. Thank you, and now back to our conversation.
Well, there's no one element to it. There are many elements. I would say the first thing to leap to my mind is that we're no longer as distant from the rest of the nation as we were. That we're it's the highway system went in the 50s. That really changed things. Then Albuquerque became a major airport, major in quotation marks, but it became an airport in which people actually flew into from around the nation. It says it's international, and occasionally it actually is. So I think that then many more people, it's no longer true that people, I suppose there are still pockets of people who don't know where New Mexico is, but it's not as true as it used to be. The New Mexico Magazine, I don't know whether it still does, but New Mexico Magazine used to have a page in every issue called "One of Our 50 is Missing," and it was all recordings of people who called in or wrote into the Chamber of Commerce or to the state saying, "Can we drink the water? Do you accept American money?
Yeah.
Are we going to die of diseases?" My father, in one of his Sunday columns, he had a weekly column for years in the newspaper, and one of his Sunday columns said that, I don't know whether he'd been written to or some of the state or the Chamber of Commerce, but the question was, "Do you accept American money?" To which his answer was, "Avidly."
Perfect.
So that's a major difference, is that we are now really part of the culture much more than we used to be. Our Western culture is not so distinct. Our Spanish culture is not as distinct as it was, even though it's strengthening, going back to its heritage and its language, which is really good. Still, the Spanish Americans are now much more part of the mainstream in every way, and they are much more American than they used to be. All sorts of phrases and dichos and words that used to be used commonly are no longer used, have dropped out of use. Attitudes have changed. People stopped going to church. The Spanish, who used to be absolutely regular going to church, are more than I think Anglos are, but not as the way they used to be. The Indian culture, again, has been inundated by American culture, and it's not as a part as it was when I was a child. The Indians lived on the reservation. They lived in their pueblos. They did not live anywhere else aside from a very few. Now they do. They are losing, in many cases, unfortunately, their language, which is their transmission of culture, since their languages, by and large, aren't written. And so they're becoming more like everybody else, which is a problem. We are not as far, and therefore we are also not as small. Santa Fe is not a large city, but it's a small city. It didn't used to be a city, it used to be a town. And when I was young, it really was a town with a small, intimate feel in which everybody knew everybody else's business, and everybody was acquainted with everybody, or at least knew of and heard of everybody else. And that's just no longer true. Well, it used to be that when Anglos moved here, one of the assumptions was that they would go to the Indian pueblos to watch the dances, because that was really an important part of what it meant to be a New Mexican. And the early artists and writers were fascinated by the Indians. They wrote about them, they painted them, they photographed them, and not going to an Indian dance was considered unthinkable. Now, people move here, never even crosses their minds. So that's another way in which things have changed, in which we've become more distant from our own culture and our own accumulated heritage, and more like the rest of the nation, and the Indians are those people over there, rather than part of whom we are.
So what do you think are the most important legacies that you'd like to see carried forward? I mean, if you were to think of Santa Fe as a person, as a member of the family, that get characteristics that get passed down, or if you were to write a eulogy for old Santa Fe, what aspects of it would you celebrate and hope to see carried forward into the next generation that maybe aren't being considered? I mean, you just pointed to the curiosity and integration of the three cultures, Native and Spanish and Anglo, and that's kind of getting more diluted, it sounds like you're saying.
Well, it is, because the outside American culture really has flooded New Mexico. It's inevitable because of media, televisions, movies to a lesser extent, but especially television and now every other sort of media, and all the people who are able to easily move in and move out and move through. And all the tourists, we've had tourists for a long time, but now we have floods of tourists, which we did not have when I was young. The tourist season was essentially the summer, and then that was that. After the summer was over, we had the town back to ourselves. That just isn't true any longer. All these influences water down and dilute what were three strong cultures that lived side by side. So I suppose one of the things I'd want to see continued into the future are the three cultures living side by side, distinct yet together, and strongly themselves in their heritage, strongly themselves. There is a politically correct sentiment that we are multicultural. Oh, there are all sorts of cultures, we're not just three cultures. I disagree. There's the Indian culture, there's the Spanish culture, and then, as it is with the culture back east in Pennsylvania, there are the Amish, and there's everybody else, and everybody else is who they aren't, and they are the English. Here, if you aren't Spanish and you aren't Indian, you are Anglo, which means just everybody else. And I think that is an accurate reproduction of the way we live and the way we view ourselves, is that we are Anglo, we are Indian or Spanish, or both. And then everybody else, whether they're Anglo-American, Irish-American, Italian, Black or Chinese, they're Anglo because of, not of whom they are, but of whom they're not. I think that needs to be continued. I definitely think that the artistic colony, the creative colony we have here in all of its forms, which is, I don't see any chance of its changing anytime soon because it's so strong, but I think that needs to be continued because that's very much part of whom we are. I would like us to continue to be somewhat separate from the rest of the country in order to maintain these qualities in our identity.
Yeah. It's so interesting, having lived here for 10 years. It is like no place I've ever lived. I feel like it's a place where it requires being here 10 years for it even to start to open itself up to you, and that it's a place that reveals itself to you, just like a person. As you get to know it, the more it opens up and reveals itself to you, and then you learn more about the history. And there are so many things that I love about Santa Fe, and one of them is that, and this might be actually contributing to what you're not happy about, but the people who move here seem to come here so deliberately. They are drawn here because there seems to be something that magnetically attracts them, that says, that maintains their integrity, or even blossoms their integrity. People come here at a certain stage of life. They've lived a whole life somewhere else, and they come here to do their real work, or their artistic work, or the fullest expression of their work. And I think there's something about Santa Fe that really attracts that. There's something about the energy here, without getting too woo, but there's something really here. So say a little bit what your experience of that would be. What do you think it is that draws people here? The kind of people that will carry on these characteristics that you think are important.
First, I have to say that one of the things that has changed is, well, a couple of things that have changed. First, it is my impression that a lot more people in the old days came here by accident. They came here, loved it, and decided to stay. Whereas I don't think there's so many accidental people have come here more or less accidentally. They've come here, they unexpectedly fell in love with it, and then stayed. I don't think that happens quite so often, or if it does, it's not quite so visible. The other thing I would say is that more people now here come deliberately. It's because it's hip and cool and it has a high profile, and we're in the top 10 list of favorite places to go to. So a lot of people come here because of our high profile and because it's hip and cool. Ever since 1982, when we were on the cover of 3 magazines and we were declared by Esquire to be as the place to be, people now come here much more deliberately and not than they used to, and not because of the interesting and exotic cultures, but because it's, I have to repeat myself, hip and cool to be here, or everybody else says, oh, you've got to go. And so there are increasingly a contingent of people who are drawn to a colony of people who are here because it's the place to be. And those people tend not to be interested in the depth of the culture, not in the Indian and Spanish cultures. They tend to be here and then to talk mostly among themselves. There's certainly, I think, the film colony here, or what is a potential film colony, are actors, writers, directors, producers. I get the impression they're mostly interested in each other. And I hope I'm wrong. But I get that feeling. I think a lot of people here are here because they are interested in each other and not because they're interested in everybody else.
Yeah, well, I think there's this saying that Santa Fe either draws you in or spits you out, and that those people that aren't here that don't resonate with the true spirit of the place may be here for a time, but eventually they kind of get pushed along.
That's often true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, we have another phenomenon that we have more than we used to is people who are part-time residents, the second homes, especially the wealthy. Now, the wealthy used to come here and didn't show off their wealth. That's important. They didn't show off their wealth. They didn't make it obvious. They didn't show it off in the sense of making other people see, you see how important and how rich I am. Now they build on ridge tops, so everybody has to look at them. They get the view, we get to look at them. And they are much more, I'm generalizing, of course, condescending. And second homes, as it were, I think are a bad phenomenon, because that house then sits empty part of the year. And if it's empty as a hole in the fabric of the neighborhood, as a hole is in a sweater. So both people with second homes and now these damnable Airbnb apartments and houses all over the place are all holes in the fabric of the neighborhood. People who don't vote, people who don't care about local problems and local issues, people who don't know their neighbors terribly well. They're just not fully present, and that's a damaging change.
So what do you think that we can do as a community to maintain the integrity and bring back some of the qualities of the old Santa Fe that you remember?
I don't know. I don't think it can be necessarily brought back. I think that if the Spanish-American culture continues to work on maintaining its language and resurrecting the old culture and its old folkways, especially in the northern villages, that would help. If the Indians are not drowned in the popular culture, but don't lose their languages and don't view themselves as. I was at a hearing last night about the monument that was torn down in the plaza, and there are a lot of Indians who are angry and hostile, and that never used to be the case. I think that's a damaging change. I think that if they should maintain their integrity, but not maintain it in a hostile way, but in an integral way, that would help. I think it would help if the Anglo contingent, became genuinely interested in the other two cultures and in the history of Santa Fe. New Mexico has a fascinating, complicated, and deep history, more so than, if not every other state in the Union, then almost every other state in the Union. Massachusetts might be an exception, but our culture here is deep and rich and complicated, and people need to know, I think as a generality, people need to know more about it, how we came to be whom we are, and why.
Yeah. And it would be interesting to explore what vehicles we have for that, to have people. I know I was visiting Montreal, and they have this wonderful program at night where the history and culture department project these images of these old movies on sides of buildings. And you have an app that you can listen to that sort of gives the history of Montreal at night, which is amazing because in the winter it's so dark there that the days are shorter. So it opens up a whole possibility for how to learn about the history. And I've had this idea for Santa Fe to have similar projections on adobe walls that talk about, little snippets of the history here and there, so that even people who live here can learn more about it. Because as I said, I've been here 10 years and I'm only just now starting to be able to peel back the layers and understand all the various versions of Santa Fe that there are.
Well, certainly, that's an interesting idea. And certainly reading about this town, the town and the state, there are a lot of books about culture and history here that are read by historians and people interested in culture, but they really should be more widely disseminated, especially the books on history. And we have a lot of history here. I think it would help if people, for Santa Fe in particular, I think people should belong to the old Santa Fe Association, on whose board I serve.
I didn't know there was one. Here, another thing I'm learning after 10 years. The old Santa Fe Association.
The old Santa Fe Association is 100 years old this year, and it is dedicated to the preservation of our culture and our heritage and our buildings and the welfare of the town. It has been, over 100 years at various times, an extraordinarily important organization. It started in a fight to not bring a Chautauqua here to Santa Fe, which was deemed, and it's a somewhat complicated story, it was deemed irrelevant, and it was stopped. And then at various times it came back to stop a highway being put through in the center of town in the 1940s, came alive again to preserve the Barrio Analco and the historic dwellings of Santa Fe, and to keep the city from being built over by buildings and culture that had nothing to do with Santa Fe in the 1950s, which my father and John Cruikshank then wrote the Historic Styles Ordinance, which is the precursor of today's Historic District Ordinance, in 1957. And that was to preserve the historic areas of Santa Fe from being ruined, really, by potential buildings that had nothing to do with our culture and heritage. It is an organization that has not had as high a profile as it should in the last few decades, but it does important work in preserving our culture, our heritage, our buildings, and in fighting against bad ideas, bad buildings, bad developments, those things in town which tear away at our integrity. An example might be the plans for St. Francis Drive, which is going to make it from a semi-rural drive into a completely built-up drive, the way more akin to Cerrillos Road than to what it has been. And the last really untouched entrance into town from Las Vegas, Old Pecos Trail, is under threat as well. Those are the things that the Old Santa Fe Association fights against, trying to maintain the integrity. And there's a lot more that we do.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because if you think of Santa Fe, and one of the reasons I thought of having this conversation with you is that I like the idea of thinking of Santa Fe as if it was a person with a personality and a lifespan. And, it's interesting to think of how anybody goes through life and changes and incorporates the new things that they learn, but also maintains a sense of themselves. And so when we think about writing a eulogy for Santa Fe, I mean, well, hopefully it's not dying, so that would not be appropriate. But like, how does a community maintain its integrity, maintain its sense of self and its sense of soul, and still adapt to new circumstances? And I think it's what many communities are trying to do and are faced with. And it's a really interesting problem. How do we do that? But I think of Santa Fe has got such specific personality traits and characteristics that make it so unique in the United States. And, you know, it's more nostalgic about the idea of keeping Santa Fe's integrity intact. And yet we still have to come into the modern age in some way, shape, or form. So how do you grapple with those two things in your own mind?
Well, there is nostalgia, and to a certain degree with the work I've done on, for instance, Turn Left the Sleeping Dog, was a form of nostalgia. But it isn't just nostalgia. We live in our history in a way that few other places do in America. We live within our history. It is all around us. It is what has created the state in our cultures. So it is very much a living history in a way that it wouldn't be in many other places, because the history is so scattered, so forgotten, and it's because people have moved in and out so much that the history is less integral. I think that preservation of what you're talking about, of history and culture, really has to be a conscious effort. All too often it is not conscious. It is left to those people over there. We're just going to go along with whatever happens. I think if people value history, if they value culture, if they value heritage, if they value integrity, they have to work for it. They have to be conscious of it. They have to appreciate it. They have to learn about it. And it can't just be left up to somebody else. They have to participate in this, which is why the Old Santa Fe Association is so important, is as a way to participate in keeping integral our culture, our heritage, and our history. I think it's something that has to be thoughtfully done. Many of the problems that we have now with bad developments, bad buildings, bad ideas is that people just don't think. They're not thoughtful about what they do. They're doing what they want to do without any real thought for, is this a good idea? How is this going to affect the culture? How is it going to affect the city? How is it going to affect the people? Or they don't care because there's money to be made. I think it has to be approached in a thoughtful manner, and really has to be a thoughtful process of participating and not just leaving it up to somebody else to do it.
That's such a perfect way to talk about everything that we're trying to do with the whole Art Bridge initiative, is to bring people into this deliberate living, deliberate thinking about their own lives, the choices that they make on a daily basis, and how that contributes to the legacy that they leave behind. And when we talk about legacy at ArtBridge, we're not talking about a name on a building. We're talking about that echo of who we are as a people, how we leave behind what matters to us, what we care about, which is exactly why I wanted to talk to you about the city of Santa Fe. And I think you made a perfect case for why Santa Fe needs to be considered in that very deliberate way.
Having said that, I have another appointment, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw this to a close.
Perfect. Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Pen. That was fantastic, and to be continued. So thanks for joining us today. ArtStorming is brought to you and supported by ArtBridge NM and listeners like you. Look for us on your favorite podcast platforms or wherever you listen. Your subscriptions, likes, comments, and shares help us to reach more listeners and attract the support we need to thrive in these challenging times. If you love what you hear, please consider making a contribution. We rely on your help to keep these conversations going. Every dollar you contribute goes directly into programs that support our mission. And we've been offered a matching grant that will match every dollar that you contribute. That means more compelling stories, more in-depth articles, and an even greater impact on our community. Please visit our website at www.artbridgenm.org, and thank you so much for being an essential part of our work.